I think that, we have to stop asking this, what does China want question. We have to stop, thinking of China just sort of as this, looming, rising threat of uncertainty. And we need to make a clear-eyed, really frank, really sober reckoning with what it actually is. Just understand it on its own terms, understanding that this is, happening at a civilizational scale.
Today on Conversation Changers, we're going to talk about China. When we think of the handful of megatrends that are shaping the 21st century, things like climate change, artificial intelligence, and pandemics, well, China is also on that list. This is a country that in my lifetime, and I'm 55 years old, has transformed from one of the poorest countries to the world's second largest economy. When I first went to China back in the late 80s and 90s, I stayed with a family where we had to use ration cards to get food every week. Monday was rice, Tuesday was oil, and so on. We had these little tickets, and each one was color-coded, and you could only get a certain amount of food on that particular day. There were very few luxuries in Chinese daily life back then. There also wasn't a lot of color. People's clothes were browns and blacks and dark blues, and that kind of symbolized the way that life was for most people. It's funny because when I tell these stories to young Chinese people today, they just can't get enough of it. They just laugh. They can't believe it. To them, this would be inconceivable what life was like before WeChat. Lightning fast food deliveries, electric vehicles, beautiful subways, and luxuries that their grandparents could never have dreamed of. But as China grows and flexes its strength, it's also causing a lot of anxiety among the world's incumbent powers in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia. And that's why China has become such a polarizing topic where a lot of the people already have their minds made up. China is either the best thing that's ever happened to the world in recent years or the worst. Today, I want to introduce you to someone who's been wrestling with these questions for 40 years and is one of the most important voices in the global discourse about China. Kaiser Kuo is a Salzburg Global Fellow and host of the indispensable Sinica podcast, a show that's long been essential listening in the China-watching community. Kaiser's ideas and his discussions with key thought leaders have been instrumental on shaping the discourse on China, especially in the US, and I'm thrilled to have him on the show today. Kaiser, welcome to Conversation Changers.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's just really great to be here. What a fantastic intro you just did. I wish I should have written it all down. I mean, that was really great.
Well, you and I have had a similar journey, and I know that you can relate to some of those early days in the late 80s and the early 90s when life was a lot more simple in China than it is today. Tell us a little bit about your early China story when you started to go there, because you and I were there at the same time.
Yeah, sure. My folks actually were both born in mainland China and both went to Taiwan in their teens. My mom actually went when she was only about 10 years old, but they spent a while in Taiwan before emigrating to the U.S. They still always identified as being from mainland China, and their politics were fairly left-leaning. And so quite early on, my father started going back to China in 1975, before Mao's death, even before the earthquake, before so much changed. He had already taken his first trip to China. And so quite early, 1981 was my first trip. I was 15. I'm a little bit older than you. And the description that you just gave of the ration cards, of the sort of monochrome society, that all is absolutely right. You can throw in more color. You can throw in, the ubiquity of donkey carts and horse carts, and how, there was always horse dung in the roads and so few private automobiles, and what a low slung landscape, the cityscape of a city like Beijing that we now know from its iconic architecture. There were few buildings over 7 or 8 stories tall. It was just an absolute different world. So yeah, that's what resonated so much. And I've had that same experience of trying to explain that to youngsters and just having them, cackle with glee. Just think, this is just unimaginable.
And I guess that's the way it should be. They for them, everything before them was ancient history. But one of the things that I've noticed in the time that you and I, and again, you're a little bit older than I am, but in the time that we've been studying and looking at this issue, is that China 20 years ago wasn't a polarizing issue. Remember when Bill Clinton was there speaking at Beijing University, and he was talking about bringing China into the global community? There was a lot of support in the rest of the world to integrating China into the global economy. Fast forward now into, and it's not even a new phenomenon. Really, it started in 20 years ago, and it became increasingly concerning to people in the US and Europe and even parts of Asia as well, that China's changing the rules, and China is this transformational force in the 21st century. And that's causing a lot of consternation, provoking what we now have is these very polarized extreme views on China, so-called dragon slayers on one side and panda huggers on the other side. Help us understand the landscape of the discourse today.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you say, 20 years ago, things were slightly different. I think that we already had that taxonomy. There were people who, I think dragon slayers and panda huggers, that dichotomy goes all the way back to, my God, to the 80s probably. There were people already who were sort of sounding the alarm about, China's inexorable rise and how it was going to, it was a revanchist power. It was going to upset the apple cart and, challenge the status quo. And the debate, has really had its same basic contours. It's just not been quite as exaggerated as it is now. It's not quite as intense as it's become, really just only, I would put it, the intensification of the debate only starts about 15 years ago. 20 years ago, puts us back in 2005 in the middle of what I would describe as sort of a golden age. And I think that the main feature of that time was that we weren't thinking that much about China. If you think back in the period between, say, September 11th, 2001 and the Olympics, there was almost nothing that really roiled the waters in the U.S.-China relationship, in the Europe-China relationship. You would be hard-pressed to think of any issue that really rose to the level of what we've seen just in more recent years, things like Xinjiang or Hong Kong or more Taiwan Straits crises, things like, technology competition, things like this. There really wasn't that level of bilateral angst. And I think that there's real reason for that. We can get into that later. But you asked me about what these two camps are. I think that it boils down to a few things on which they disagree profoundly. And we've seen this just in the last week, over the release of a paper in MIT publication, actually, of all places, by a scholar by the name of Dave Kang, K-A-N-G, who is an international relations scholar. And he put out a paper along with two colleagues, at different universities. And I'm actually going to be interviewing them for my podcast, in which he makes the argument that China is not a revisionist power. It is not seeking to upset the status quo, that it doesn't seek really anything beyond hegemony in its own neighborhood. And, I think that there's been a lot of pushback, a lot of challenges to it, but we've seen how this has polarized people. And the argument becomes, all about what does China want? There are people who simply believe that China, like other great powers who've had the wherewithal to spread their, to project their power, to, push their own ideological preferences, that they would do so, that China will do so. They believe that China has this sort of middle kingdom mentality, a tianxia, a sort of ruling the sub-celestial mentality, that as soon as it's able to, it will project power far and wide. The other camp believes that no, that China is actually relatively restrained power, that there's no evidence to suggest that when it has had the opportunity, it has tried to push its ideology abroad, that it is defensive, essentially, that it is, reactive to external stimuli, but that it isn't a unilateral sort of hegemony seeker. So that's I think, at the center of it. But I think that there's more to it. I think another big piece of it is legitimacy. I think that one of the things that the dragon slayers, the so-called dragon slayers, sort of have in common is that they do not ascribe political legitimacy to the Chinese Communist Party. They simply believe in their heart of hearts that it not having arrived in its position through electoral, democracy, through procedural democracy, it does not possess political legitimacy. And therefore, ultimately, what they want to see is that regime brought down. Where I think that's the opposite side of where your so-called panda huggers sit, where they believe that the regime does possess legitimacy, that it, derives from its performance, its, performance legitimacy, or, from historical reasons, or for, its preservation of China's national dignity, for its, various other things, but that ultimately it does possess legitimacy. So I think it comes down to really these two questions.
And there is a profound sense, and you've talked a lot about this on your show over the years, of disappointment among many in the US and Europe who really had the expectation that if we engage China, and this is, remember, U.S. Trade Representative Charlene Barshefsky, this was Bill Clinton's era in the mid-90s, that if we trade with China, we bring them into the World Trade Organization, then they will become like us inevitably. They will want to become materially like us, they will want to liberalize like us, and eventually, maybe they will democratize and they will politically modernize like us. And there's a sense that today that people were tricked, that China came in, took advantage of the system, and we hear this a lot from its critics saying that they stole our intellectual property, they stole our jobs, and a lot of the basis of the grievance that Donald Trump and conservative politicians in Europe have today is anchored in this sense of the system was rigged by China. They took advantage of us, they took everything from us. Help us understand the origins of that narrative. And there was a book by the former LA Times correspondent in Beijing. I forget the name of it, but he was one of the first to identify this, that says, listen, everybody, China is not going to be like the West. China is going to modernize, but not Westernize. That's a concept that I think was quite shocking to a lot of people in the US and Europe.
I think that there's a bit of straw man going on here. I think there's this idea that we all, everyone who signed on for engagement, capital E engagement as a policy toward China did so in the expectation that they would simply become a liberal capitalist democracy. I don't think that's the case. I think that if you really go back and you look at the origins of the policy of engagement, which originates even before Richard Nixon, it's something that's being argued for. Its real architect, you could say, was actually Henry Kissinger. And who did Henry Kissinger study? Who did he really admire? He admired Metternich. He admired the people who put together sort of the post-Napoleonic world, the world of the 1840s and 1850s, where you tried to engage revolutionary France in this, system of alliances and these systems of by which it was sort of entangled. It was defanged by not being able, to sort of export its revolutionary fervor. And this is really what he had in mind with China, that China would be sort of convinced that it was in its own best interest to play along, to sort of join the international order and not to export, revolution to the global south as it had been doing, right? And I think that the goals were much more modest. Now, can you cherry pick? Can you go back through the record and find utterances by people like you said, like Bill Clinton or Charlene Barshefsky, that seem to indicate that that's what they thought that was what we were signing on for? Sure. I mean, you can go back, you can find a couple of speeches that Clinton gave. There's usually the same 2 or 3 that are cited over and over and over again. But I don't think that stands up. I don't think that that's really what most people believed. Like 2007, 2008, that is sort of the time at which China was most like us, as it were. Let me just pretend for a moment that I do side on to this idea that the goal of engagement was to make China more like us. You could make a pretty strong case that it was working, and it was working pretty well. If you looked at China circa 2007 or 2008, you looked at its institutions, you looked at its systems, you looked at everything, the standards that it used, you looked at even the beliefs of people, you would see a couple of things. First of all, that in the very places where engagement actually was manifest, that is where there was a lot of articulation between, Western presence and Chinese people, that's where the values had shifted the most. That's where they were, quote unquote, most like us. That's where these institutions, these systems, these norms had actually appreciably moved in a sort of Western, if you would, direction. There's just no question to me. I mean, this is borne out in all the survey research that you look at. There's no question that those places that had the most exposure to the outside world were the most pluralistic in their thinking, that had the most sort of sort of what we like to think of as Western humanist values. I think that anyone, time traveling from 1978, from, before reform and opening began to 2008, skipping ahead those 40 years or whatever, would have been just, it's only 30 years. They would have been just absolutely astonished at how much it had become more like the U.S. They would have concluded that it had become basically a capitalist, liberal society. So I think by either count, the people who have declared engagement some sort of failure I don't think that their arguments have merit.
But when we look at the trajectory of this narrative that started in the 90s and where we are today, you say that there's now a shift that's happening in the West. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think that there's a very big shift. It's happening, and I think it's quite pronounced this year. I think 2004 saw this real nadir. I mean, it had begun really in the first trade war. It deepened during COVID, but it really hit rock bottom in roughly 2024. 22 was an awful year. 23, 24. It's gotten really, really bad. If you look at, Pew polling, Pew is probably, the organization that does this most regularly, but it's borne out everywhere. Everywhere where you look at American and, more broadly Western attitudes toward China, they were at a really low ebb, but they have really started to recover. And I think most significantly, we're seeing a big shift in younger people, in sort of the 18 to 25 crowd. And I think that what's significant about that is a leading indicator. That's not a lagging indicator. These people will be around for a while. Their ideas are being formed about China right now. There's a kind of collective sense that they've been gaslit by the Western media. They're suddenly seeing all this stuff that, some friends of mine describe as sort of infrastructure porn, in their social feeds, constant pictures of, Chinese high-speed rails and, glittering skylines all lit up with LEDs and drone displays, the lives of ordinary people, fancy cities like Shenzhen or Hangzhou or Chongqing, and of course Shanghai. I think there were a couple of factors here. One was, of course, this DeepSeek moment that happened in January, when this sort of, out of nowhere, this quite frontier level AI, this LLM, comes out of a company that very few people outside of the industry had ever heard of before. And it's performing on par with the best models. It's an open source model, and it was trained, relatively inexpensively. So it was very, very disruptive, as we remember from, our stock portfolios right in January after this happened. But you also, had this whole refugee phenomenon, all these people who had fled TikTok ahead of the threatened, ban, the closing of America's TikTok. And they all went to Xiaohongshu, to RedNote, this Chinese app with a Chinese interface. And it was just sort of this kind of flip, mocking exercise initially, but, they were welcomed warmly. They liked what they saw. They saw, things that were pretty impressive. I mean, I said at the time, they're not looking at a Potemkin village. They're looking at really the very nice parts of a real village. What they saw, these basically upper middle class Shanghainese people, younger, skewing female, skewing, quite educated, and the lives that they were living there, they were envious. It reinforced the sense that they had sort of been gaslit. And then that opened a flood of a lot of.
While the gaslighting is certainly something to reckon, I think critics would probably say, well, that's one part of the society. That's the nice part, the EVs, the subways, the infrastructure porn, these amazing kind of views of Chongqing, this, it looks like a cyber city and they've been bringing in iShow speed and these influencers, and it's been very effective. Some would even say it's a propaganda campaign to mask some of the darker sides of Chinese society. Obviously,
that's what propaganda does. Yeah,
that's right. And there's human rights concerns. There's a slowing economy. There's a lot of sclerosis in the labor market of young people trying to get their way in, people over 35 getting pushed out. And so it's the positive, shiny, gleamy things, yes. But then what about the more challenging sides of Chinese society that these images aren't showing?
Well, they're certainly there. I mean, it's not like that is absent from the discourse either. I think that this has been a pretty healthy corrective, though, because we weren't hearing that side of it. All we were hearing was, the sort of negatives. That's reflected in the Pew attitude surveys and the ideas that people had about China. They were very incomplete pictures. I mean, let's face it. I don't, like the propaganda. I think that it's shallow. It sets up, I think, false expectations. And, this idea, the problem that so many Americans have about China is it's imagined for them. It's Middle Earth. I mean, it's not a real place for so many of them. They can project onto it all of their fears or their hopes, their technophilic and techno-utopian fantasies or their kind of dystopian fantasies. And I really want people to simply see it for what it really is. I mean, and it can be viewed from and should be viewed from all sorts of perspectives. And like any society, it's got its ugly parts and it's got its pretty parts. And, the idea that there's only one truth is absurd, right? I mean, we know that. I mean, it shouldn't require arguing. I mean, it shouldn't require, right.
And also that Pew survey that you referenced also reveals some very stark divergences between how Europeans, Japanese, and Americans view China and those in many of developing countries where China's views are much stronger, much more positive. And in many ways, again, people in developing countries have seen how a country like China, can modernize without westernizing, which is very important. And at the same time, they can do it within a single generation. That it's possible to move from a country where there was ration books to modern subways in one lifetime. And that has been very inspiring for a lot of people who have been stuck at the bottom of the development pyramid. And so they look at China as an example.
Right. I mean, for all the things you talk about, youth unemployment and a slowing housing market and, flagging demand and all the stuff. Sure. It still doesn't take the shine completely off the massive poverty reduction. China is responsible for the overwhelming preponderance of poverty reduction in the 20th century, right? I mean, it's absolutely overwhelming. Most of the poverty eradication really that has happened in the world has happened in China. There's a lot of reasons to be very impressed. I mean, I actually think that we are on the cusp of a really, really big change in the way we're being forced to think about China.
You've called this the Great Reckoning is what you're thinking of it as.
Yeah. I mean, that's the name I'm playing with. Yeah. The Great Reckoning. I mean, I think we're at kind of, I would call it kind of civilizational inflection point. I mean, China's emergence as this, quite comprehensive, you might even say sort of, multidimensional power. It's not just geopolitics that it's impacting. It's our idea of ourself as a civilization. It's changing how we think about, as you said, modernity itself, that it's not just something that is, the property of the West and everyone else is just simply a latecomer trying to imitate her, to join on. I think China now has become a principal, architect, if you will, of 21st century modernity. So yeah, I think it's changing how we are thinking about, pretty much everything. I mean, this old framing that we have been accustomed to of China as a rising power or China is, catching up with the West. I think that if it doesn't already need to be completely discarded, it will soon. I mean, I think that we have, been clinging to this idea that China is just sort of like a pacing threat. It's, helping to, it's just sort of a threat that's just pushing us to move fast. No, it's no longer that. It is actually defining the pace. It's setting the pace. It's actually, really kind of drawing out the trajectory. So I mean, that's where we are right now. I think that
you can understand why that's causing angst
absolutely
among people who have been accustomed to setting the pace for centuries.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big psychic shock. I mean, it's absolutely a big psychic shock. And, that's why we are seeing so much, denial, so much, copium smoking, so much, anxiety, so much panic in response to it. I think that's part of it. And I can't help but think that, that reflex when you see the shiny infrastructure porn and when you see all that stuff, to immediately reach for the copium pipe and saying, but there's this dark side, or at what cost, that I think we have to stop doing so reflexively. I mean, it's really kind of delaying, our real reckoning with this. We have to acknowledge that there's been this massive shift to the gravitational center of global power, of global production, of technology innovation. It's already shifted. It's continuing to shift. It's no longer anchored in the North Atlantic the way that it has been for so very long. I mean, it's measurable. Yeah, I think we do.
We want to wrap up this episode of Conversation Changers with the question that we're going to ask every guest. What's one aspect of the China conversation that you want to change?
Well, I think this is it right here. I think that, we have to stop asking this, what does China want question. We have to stop, thinking of China just sort of as this, looming, rising threat of uncertainty. And we need to make a clear-eyed, really frank, really sober reckoning with what it actually is. Just understand it on its own terms, understanding that this is, happening at a civilizational scale. Just really answering some of the tough questions about what does this do to our long cherished, exceptionalisms? What's the Chinese brand of exceptionalism that's now on the scene? How can we live with that? How can we accommodate that? We're not asking the really, really hard questions yet. We're not asking, can, America cede? Can it make room? Can it just set aside its impulse to, for primacy and for hegemony? Not an easy one.
Not an easy one.
I mean, there's questions about race that we haven't really answered. There's all sorts of questions about these subconscious sort of hierarchies that are just so embedded in our thinking. And, when I say we, I mean, I mean really the whole world, but I mean, I think it's, and the other thing, I guess, Eric, I mean, and since I want to say, you're somebody who has just helped me to think about so much of this stuff, just especially with the global South. And I think that, this isn't the last time that we're going to be compelled into kind of major rethink like this. Currents are already rising across, much of what we call the global South. And that is going to reorder our expectations in ways that we cannot even begin to anticipate right now. And China, like I said, it's sort of only the one of few. It has definitely unsettled a lot of our presumptions about modernity, about how it's, flowed from one source, but we're going to be in for more unsettling of that in the future. So we should get used to it. That's how I would like to change the conversation.
There we go. Kaiser Kuo is host of the absolutely indispensable Sinica podcast. And if you're interested in China and a lot of these issues that Kaiser touched on in this conversation, then you cannot miss what Kaiser's talking about with his guests every week on the Sinica podcast. Kaiser, if people want to find all the great work that you're doing, where can they go to find that?
Yeah, anywhere where you get your podcasts, you go to just Sinica, Sinica. You can find that on, everything, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcasts. But if you really want to support the work I'm doing, sinicapodcast.com, Sinica podcast.com. And there I've got my newsletter. I'm not the only one writing there. There's regular columns from some really great columnists, lots of really good commentary. And you can also find a podcast I particularly love called the China Global South podcast there.
That's that in my day job outside of Conversation Changers, I also host a podcast on China, and I've been partners with Kaiser for a long time. So it's great to have you on this edition of Conversation Changers, where worlds are colliding. Once again, thank you so much for your time today and for being a guest on Conversation Changers. Kaiser is a Salzburg Global Fellow and typical of the kind of conversations that we're going to have on this show every 2 weeks. We hope that you'll continue to join us. So on behalf of Kaiser Kuo, I'm Eric Olander, and for the entire Salzburg Global team, thank you so much for listening and for watching.
In an age of polarized voices and reinforced views, be part of changing the conversation. Follow us on social media and visit us at salzburgglobal.org.